The Catalina has many claims to fame. It was a Catalina that spotted the Bismarck, and it was also a Catalina that spotted Japanese troop transports and then the carrier fleet sailing towards Midway, proving a turning point in the Pacific War. Catalinas range far and wide out into the Atlantic and north towards the Arctic Circle, protecting convoys and sinking submarines. In the UK, there are few multi-engine military aircraft still flying, and even fewer that boast a wartime service record like this Catalina. I am privileged to be a part owner and pilot of this unsung hero of the Second World War. I am Jeff Boyling, and I'm standing in front of a Catalina flying boat owned by Catalina Aircraft Limited, operated by Plain Sailing Air Displays Limited, and supported by the Catalina Society. The Catalina was developed in the early 30s with the prototype flying for the first time in March 1935. It was advanced for its time and was designed to patrol and defend, if necessary, the USA's long coastlines and down to the Panama Canal Zone. The aircraft has a distinctive shape, attractive to some, ugly to others. Looking at the fuselage, you can see the distinct marine shape, including the step underneath the hull. On water, the nose wheel would be retracted, the main wheels would be in the side of the fuselage, and the water at rest would come up just under mist pickup. The 104-foot wing is mounted on a pylon supported by 4 struts. This is greater than the 102-foot wingspan of a Lancaster bomber or the 103-foot of the B-17, but not as great as the 113 feet of the Sunderland flying boat. Unlike the Sunderland, the Catalina has wingtip floats. These are retracted during flight and lowered for landing and takeoff on water. Of all the aircraft I fly, this is the only one where I can change its wingspan in flight. This pylon-mounted wing configuration means the engines are high up to minimise water damage during any water work. It was armed with a number of .3 and .5 caliber machine guns, and under the wings it could carry depth charges, torpedoes, acoustic mines, or conventional bombs.
But it was a completely different type of flying. See, with a Cat that used to be about 3'6" or 4 feet in the water, and that had to be lifted up for the hull to plane. It took quite a bit of doing. You'd have to pull the throttle right back so as you're lifting the plane up all the time. Once you started planing, you would lift your floats up and they'd become part of the wing and give you that extra bit of lift that you needed to get out of a place like Lake Kobula.
These are the modern Perspex blisters that are great for sightseeing, but in wartime days, the crew for the pure flying boats would come out in a launch and board through the wartime blister. 2 crewmen would stay here to man the 50 caliber machine guns, and the rest of the crew would move forward. In the pylon, where that window is, the engineer would sit so as he could monitor the engines as well as the engine controls in front of him. The rest of the crew would move forward, and in the forward compartment, you would have the radio operator on this side and the navigator on the far side. Finally, the 2 pilots would go into the cockpit, and the last airman would mount the nose to observe what's happening and man the machine gun that's there. Having flown this aircraft for a number of years, I know from experience it is a hands-on aircraft, as it's not stable and can wander easily. During the war, they had a Sperry autopilot, which in fact kept the wings level. This was removed along with the blisters and armaments when the aircraft was demilitarised. These days, it's flown with a minimum crew of 3, 2 pilots and a crew chief. 1 pilot will fly the aircraft while the other deals with radios and navigation. The crew chief prepares the aircraft and ensures the gear and floats operate correctly. Its best quality was probably range, being able to go over 2,000 nautical miles. We hear of commercial long-range flights today, but actually, a Catalina holds the record in terms of duration. During the war, there were 271 flights between Perth in Western Australia and Ceylon, Sri Lanka as we now know it, and they were known as the double sunrise flights, as they were over 24 hours long. In fact, the longest was over 31 hours. On the other hand, its weakness was it was slow and not well defended, which made it vulnerable to attack, unlike the Sunderland flying boats.
They're very, very clumsy things when they're not in the air. They're not responsible like a boat is. I mean, they won't go backwards. And they're very, very fragile compared with the ordinary land airplane. They're fine in the air, but they lost a great number of them at moorings. I mean, in a gale like we had the other day, they'd have lost every one in the country, unless they could have beached them quickly.
Now, these aircraft go by various names. PBY. P meant patrol, B meant bomber, and Y was the code given to Consolidated since C had already been allocated to Curtis. Catalina, well, that's the name of the island off San Diego, where Consolidated had their main factory. The PBY-1 through the PBY-5 were pure flying boats, while the PBY-5A and the PBY-6A were the amphibian versions. This particular aircraft was constructed in 1943 under contract by Canadian Vickers at Carterville in Quebec and operated by the Royal Canadian Air Force from 1943 to 1961. As such, it was called a Canzo, another name but the one used for Canadian-built and operated Catalinas. Its military career with the Royal Canadian Air Force included wartime operations with 9 BR Squadron and a post-war spell with the famous 413 Tusker Squadron, which had operated Catalina flying boats with distinction with the Royal Air Force in Scotland and the Indian Ocean during World War II.
Day and night, these offensive patrols are flown. A sighting has been made. Periscope. Lethal bulk rising from the sea. The pilot is informed. The navigator notes the aircraft's location, and the wireless operator transmits a sighting report. The aircraft loses altitude, preparing to attack. Closer. Closer. Stand by. Now, the attack. The most effective single stratagem in the winning of the Battle of the Atlantic.
There were other flying boats used during the war, namely the Short Sunderland, PBM Mariner, Grumman Goose, and Supermarine Walrus, to name the main types. The Goose and Walrus had limited range and were small, so best suited for close-in air-sea rescue work. The Sunderland had good range and was also well defended, hence the name the Flying Porcupine, as it bristled with machine guns. However, it was the Catalina that was the most produced and widely used.
And the Catalina was interesting because it was a very flat-bottomed boat, and if you had a rough sea, you couldn't land it in a normal, gentle way. You had to store it from about 20 feet up. When you had a rough day, you would practice this, and you'd get the thing into the fully stored position about 20 feet above the waves, the tail right down, and then suddenly it would just flop into the sea and stop dead. And the engineer then had to get out and go around and make sure you hadn't burst any rivets or anything like that.
There were 2 VCs won by Catalina pilots during the war. The first was won by Flight Lieutenant David Hornell, a Canadian, flying out of Wick in Scotland. The action involved the sinking of a submarine. During the attack, the Catalina was badly shot up. Hornell managed to land the aircraft in the sea. Unfortunately, there was only one dinghy, and therefore the crew had to take turns in the dinghy. And Hornell, despite being rescued, succumbed to his hypothermia soon afterwards. But the other VC was won by John Cruikshank. He was flying a Catalina out of Southern Bow in the Shetlands. A submarine was spotted, they went into attack, but on the first pass the depth charges did not release. So Cruikshank brought the aircraft back around and came in for a second attack. Of course, by this stage, the submarine crew were well prepared and provided a withering anti-aircraft fire. Cruikshank suffered 76 wounds and the navigator was killed. Despite this, they released the depth charges, sank the submarine. But that wasn't the end of the story. They had another 5 hours to fly to get back to Southern Bow. Cruikshank was taken to the sick bay because of his injuries and refused morphine. And after 5 hours, returned to the cockpit to assist in landing the aircraft. For this action, he was awarded a VC. He is the last surviving World War II VC holder alive. Post-war, most of the pure flying boats were disposed of. The amphibian versions had a better fate, being more versatile. There are approximately 12 Catalinas still airworthy worldwide, so being privately owned, we are very pleased to be based at the Imperial War Museum, Duxford. After this Catalina left the Royal Canadian Air Force in 1961, it had a number of careers. First, it worked as a water bomber in North America as well as in France. After that, it embarked on another career, undertaking aerial safaris in Africa. Alas, that did not take off, and so it was put up for sale, and Catalina Aircraft Limited bought her in 2002. The new colour scheme of white with US Army Air Force markings has been done to represent an air-sea rescue Catalina of the 5th Emergency Rescue Squadron that was lost during a rescue in 1945. Photos of its loss exist, as do photos of the aircraft and crew. These photos show it had nose art, and not unusual for US-operated aircraft. Consequently, this Catalina carries that artwork Miss Pickup, which, given its duties, seemed very appropriate. Of course, to keep this aircraft flying requires funds, and some of that comes from displaying at air shows, as well as selling products from the Catalina Society stall or its online shop. The fact that this aircraft is still flying is a tribute to those who initially designed and built her. Credit should be given to Arthur Gibson, John Watson, Paul Warren Wilson, who had the foresight to preserve a Catalina nearly 40 years ago. This aircraft is an important part of the aerial military history of the UK and other nations. Long may she continue to fly, so please join the Catalina Society.